So I want to welcome Rob Rogers, who is an old friend of mine at school. I say this a lot, because we've been before that. I can only remember one thing that I directly learned from a profession. The most efficient span, 1, 3, and 1. 1 cantilever, 3 span, 1. That's all I actually remember from any professors directly, specifically from Michael Underhill. But I learned from him what he said. The only thing that he remembered from the professor was 1, 3, and 1. It's like this disease that just keeps going 1, 3, and 1. The truth of the matter is, we talk about this a lot about, a lot of the discussion sections, a lot of is that you enter the world in a generation. You enter in a generation. It's remarkable how close you stay with that generation, even if it's not so close. Like Rob, Rob was 2 years ahead of me at Rice. Yeah. It was my brother's class at Rice, and then I went to New York. Rob came to New York. He was living on a houseboat. Is that right? Yeah. Houseboat in the middle of winter. He was working at IMK. I had a job at night at IMK. He played scumbag baseball, and he passed off. And every now and then you see some Rob. That's a Rob Rogers table on the Tonight Show, or after 9/11, Rob's firm, they designed these barriers down in Wall Street. They showed the Museum of Modern Art. You're tracking each other's progress and seeing each other again. It's nice that the last time I was here was such a sweet sense, because all these years passed by, it's almost like that, it's like nothing, right? And it's this really crucial thing. You enter with a generation, and it's one of the reasons why it's so important early on to establish this kind of lateral discourse in the school. I think it's critical. I have to say about Rob that, and you know this about your own classmates, right? Like, there's different kinds of classes, and when you kind of look across the kind of class and you go, who's going to do well? You can begin to kind of make some subdivisions. There are like the slackers, right? And it's always freakish when they do well. Like a good example is that guy from Snowhead who was in school here. When he was in school here, he was a complete and total slacker. And then after everyone's like, well, wow, how'd that happen? And then there are the kind of freakish extremists. They're totally bound up in something small. And it's a kind of 50-50 deal, right? Some of them are going to make it, and some of them aren't. But in neither case, you're neither surprised that they've made it or not. Either they crash and burn, you're like, you knew that was going to happen. Or it's insane, you knew that was going to happen. It's the same essential thing. And then there's this other class of we have some I like them a lot, gearheads. They just motor through everything. They're just like motor. They're the kind of guys who arrive with toilet templates to the school. They're like, I'm going to do everything. And here's the thing. What's going to happen with them. 30 years from now, you're going to be running some firm and they're going to be there with their toilet templates. Making toilet paper. It's cool. They're into it for their own reasons. And then there are guys like Rob, who you meet them and, quacks like a duck, walks like a duck, is a duck. Looks like an architect, is an architect, acts like an architect. From minute one, I have to say this about you, Rob. From minute one, it's really astonishing. I mention this because I'm teaching freshmen right now. And it's so weird with the freshmen that you get this sense, that they feel like you're somehow punishing them with an assignment. Like they're going, you're giving me homework, and you're like, aren't you? You're here voluntarily. You're choosing to do this. Right? That's such a weird, perverse thing. As opposed to someone like Rob, who, from all my recollection of Rob, is this innate positiveness about architecture. It's one of those weird things. You have 4 or 5 people like that in school, and you can tell right away. They're just genetically predispositioned in every single way to be an architect. So, to my mind, seeing the extraordinary climbing success of Rob's firm is just a kind of affirmation of what I've always thought personally. We've had a wonderful relationship with Rob's firm, Rogers Marvell. They've taken past all of our students to residency, and they always come back going, wow, that was amazing. So please help me welcome Rob.
Well, as you can imagine, I was very glad that I was 2 years ahead of David because he's a very hard act to follow. So, it's a real pleasure to be down here, and I was chatting a little bit with a couple of you. You referenced genetic predisposition, and that would be, just so you know, both of my parents graduated from the School of Architecture in 1951. So, in fact, here. So in fact, there is that, and it's sometimes, I don't know whether it's a benefit or a genetic default, but nonetheless, that's what you have, so you work with it. I'm going to talk tonight. We just have a pretty broad range of work that we've developed in the last few years. And I know because you've got a new landscape department, I know you've got a sort of really forefront thinking about the world in bigger ways than just simply what is this building, and what does it look like, and how are the toilets configured by whom. So I thought I'd take a slice through our work. I called it city work, but it's really, it's things that are, we've been trying to think about at a scale that are bigger than just a building. And that may be because of program or landscape or the environment or other elements. And although we're beginning to work broader around the country now, our sort of early on, have very much been infused with the energy that is the city. And the city is an amazing thing because it just continues to evolve and change. And what I love about living in New York City is it actually changes really fast. There are pieces that are exactly the same as they were 200 years ago, but overall as an organism, it's incredibly sort of healthy and vibrant and sort of bursting and bubbling at the seams most of the time. The last 2 years as an exception, however. But nonetheless, it will continue like that in its overall growth. So although we've built a practice doing libraries, college buildings, sort of almost performance-type public spaces where we cut our teeth learning about detailing, talking to what is contextuality, how do you build in a neighborhood so that you belong, but you also clearly have the presence of the institution that is your client. You know, little corporate headquarters in a historic district that begins to set themselves out, or museums that grow up from storefronts to begin to be institutions that are part of the street and part of the New York culture, to projects that are ongoing now that are really part of the reconstruction of the historic fabric, the recycling and reuse of the fabric of the city. So in the context of those really as individual projects, we love the sort of expand once in a while to the big bubble of remembering the staggering perception of somebody like Bucky Fuller, who was constantly trying to reimagine the city on an environmental scale, on a transportation scale, changing the way you think about your relationship with the environment. So as we began to look at these, and this was actually when we were pursuing the Brooklyn Bridge Park, we mapped Central Park into the East River to say, what if we imagined that we were recentering the city and that our harbor is our place of recreation. It's the future. It's the expanse. It's where we're going to go, and begin to treat it with the same kind of reverence and respect for building. As New York City moved from a place when at the completion of the Erie Canal moved almost 50% of the gross domestic product of the United States through the New York Harbor, the Jersey Harbor, like this pumping industrial amoeba out into the bay, where the architecture was actually overwhelmed with the commercial activity of the sailing ships, much bigger structures than most of the adjacent buildings, all around on the harbor, is absolutely and completely changed. And as we have revised our understanding of transportation, revising our understanding about information, what's available to us, how do we use it, where does it go, that the development of the cargo ship and container ships essentially erased that entire usefulness, if you will, of the coast, which is what gave birth to Manhattan in the first place. And it became empty and it was left over. And this is part of a competition that we did for the History Channel to imagine what New York might be like in 100 years. And it was beginning to think about, what is this leftover space that we've got that had the capacity, like the commercial capacity, to filter, manage, maintain, manufacture, do all these kinds of goods that's, drifted down to 4 cruise boats on Saturday, basically. And the re-envisioning of how our city can begin to work. And so we did a series of studies looking at at water management, at recreation, at open space. Where can we grow? How can we begin to take those pieces back? And for much of our practice, I probably have, among the projects I'll show tonight, almost half are probably the result of a competition, either invited, submitted, rarely paid, but once in a while, that come out. And these serve our practice really as the explorations, the places for experimentation, where you can go beyond the simple requests of the client, but insert your own imagination as broadly as possible into what may happen. And that starts even at a smaller scale, because you don't really, unfortunately, you don't get the entire coastline of the West Side as a project to work on. So you begin with morsels, if you will. And this was the opportunity to rejuvenate by competition. We were in with Ken Smith, landscape architect, a little plaza for 55 Water Street, where we really needed to reimagine this space with program, with spaces for people. How do you congregate with 4 people? How do you congregate with 20 people? And develop a way to get up to this elevated place that is significant and recognized by other elements that come in. We introduced this beacon almost as a sort of light fixture for downtown in the evening to light the park and be a part of the procession, to become a piece of the skyline, sort of clearly showing the re-embrace of the waterfront now as a new place, overcoming that commercialization. And the wonderful thing about New York is that you get to work with these amazing overlaps of the pieces and the structures of history and begin to participate. We really like to see our work in that figure, where this is a continuation of technology, opportunity, and reconsideration of what space is important. So we decided to enter the competition for Governor's Island a couple of years ago, which is the island you may know out in the harbor in New York City. And we teamed up with Adrian Gu's West 8 out of Rotterdam. And our earliest visions together in working sessions, as we began to say, said, the next century of action on the water has to be green. And not just green for sustainability, green, all those kind of things. And I have to borrow a quote because I apologize, I don't have Adrian's exquisite kind of Dutch accent American, but he said, green, like broccoli green, You don't understand what it means. And at the same time, we said, this has to be this kind of crazy opportunity of place where you have an idea about the water and you have an idea about landscape and buildings and experience that can create a phenomena that will get you on the ferry to come over there and stay over there and begin to participate. You don't know, the park is intended to be the early economic and public space driver for subsequent development. And it's a former Coast Guard station. In this photograph, you're looking at it from the south, and all of the north end, where all the beautiful trees are, is all the historic structures that was the original head of the island. If you think of it as an ice cream cone, the ice cream is the historic district, and the cone is the landfill that came from the Lexington Avenue subway, so that they could create a military base, and then this Coast Guard station. And the Coast Guard station, everything on the south side is going to be razed. Everything is going to be demolished. It's full of asbestos. It's built to U.S. federal government military standards, therefore it doesn't meet any codes of any kind for egress, buildability, anything. So it's all coming down. There's really no operative reuse. So when we were sort of faced with this hyper-historic head and this potential blank slate of the fact, we talked about, what do we do? How do you put this together, and how do you imagine it? And we said, what the island needs is a structure, a poetic structure that is really based on pedestrians and bicycles and changing the way you think about how you're going to organize the development and pieces and parts of the island. And so let's talk about how far do you like to walk? How fast do you like to ride a bike? If you're 5 and learning to ride a bike, How much space do you need? How far do you need to go? And how can you begin intersecting those movement program elements with stationary spaces and destinations and opportunities on the island? So we definitely wanted to occupy the perimeter. It's an unbelievable way to see the harbor. You're actually out in the middle, almost like you're on a boat, but you need shade and you need space, and there's no cars. It's fabulous for the city. You want to take that poetic structure and make it apparent not just in the way you move, but in the way the land can undulate and begin to manage forms and plant materials and programmatic components. And we wanted to engage the harbor and the water. You know, it's a park. When you go to the national parks, there's always a few scary places around the edge or at the precipice, somewhere where you're challenged with your own personal perceptions and your experience to think about where you are and why you're there and how it came to be. And so we really wanted the South Island to be, you know, out and within the harbor as you go around the precipice. And we were faced with this. We had to submit budgets and cost constraints as a very big formalized competition. And we were faced with the idea of, you know, my God, they've got like $40 million just to knock these buildings down and get them off and barge them off the island. So why don't we take all the debris and just stack it up and reframe it into a series of these hills that can begin to frame the views, present themselves as destination points, and introduce a kind of, remember this is 100% artificial topography, so, you know, without abandon, we felt like we could make kind of wilder introductions than we might in some other kind of native scape. Never trying to mimic a natural environment, but to make a park that's really about being in New York Harbor. And when you ascend to the top of these hills, the highest hill is just a little lower than the tallest building that was ever on the island. You can get up to about 90 feet at the top of the hill. And from that point of view, you have a 360-degree panorama across the harbor and the city, looking over into Brooklyn. Brooklyn is, you know, like 150 yards away from the shore of the island on that side. And produce a place that really is about, you know, how are we going to occupy our waterfronts and parks and places? Because the kind of underlying idea that we've been thinking about, and from that first overlay of Central Park to the East River, is that, you know, parks and those spaces, our open spaces, especially in New York City, essentially have to become our infrastructure. That is the location of our investment, and it's not just for creation of you know, pollinator bases to help support diversity of species in urban environments, but it's also for water use, for the actual, you know, recreational use of everybody that lives around. And the thing about the city is it's always forcing other sets of issues based on density and economic density, not just populous density. So kind of in a different vein, but trying to understand how we can take the components and the requirements of the criteria for the infrastructure to support the city and make those into public places and public things. We were hired to look at Battery Park City's north neighborhood after 9/11, and it included security for the World Financial Center. It included changes in traffic because they'd learned some things over 25 years after the master plan, and it included all the programmatic junk that they'd never been able to fit in, like dog runs and nurseries for the parks, and kind of, in essence, a grab bag of like, well, we got all the buildings built, but we haven't really quite accomplished these components that help build the neighborhood. And the project was driven by this sort of, you know, crazy time after 9/11 where everybody's worried about every attack, and fortunately money got poured into security projects, and so if you can do that and then get a bunch of other stuff done, that was really terrific. So we began first off by just digging deeply into what the problem was supposed to be, which is security, saying, well, you've got all these standards out there for military bases and Department of State. What do they have to do with the city? That's crazy. You know, you can't get a truck like this. You can't get a truck like that. You can't go there. So we hired traffic engineers to help us prove that you couldn't do that, and then began to insert medians and crosswalks and other pieces into the urban infrastructure that actually had to do with pedestrian amenity, but were in fact latent security devices because they reduced the requirements that we had to meet to develop the security concerns. We also said, you know, it's really dumb to spend stuff on security most of the time, in my personal opinion, because 99.9% of the time, it's never going to be used for its intended purpose. Therefore, what else can it become? So we said, let's let this security line become the connection between the World Trade Center, which is being rebuilt on the right, and the new ferry terminal at the Port Authority is developing on the Hudson on the left-hand side, and let that array of material become a night and day connection that lights this new pathway along Vesey Street from one end to the other. The trouble was, all of the junk that existed in the world to sort of put there for security purposes is big and ugly and not very well designed. We said, well, there's got to be other ways to do it, and there must be other technologies that exist that we haven't examined yet. So we began looking around, and we started working with a company that developed these arrestor beds for airport overruns, places like LaGuardia where the runway is too short. You know, if you land there, you hit the runway like that, and it's because it's so short. And so at the end of those, they actually have this compressed concrete fill that's aerated and engineered to stop a plane, but emergency personnel can get and walk around on it, and people can get out of the plane. So we said, well, what if we re-engineer that material with a much finer delta so that it actually does the same for vehicular traffic, but it still supports pedestrian traffic, which is its operation for almost all of the time. So we took that, embedded it into the streetscape elements, and incorporated it into then what was much lower definitions of physical barriers that could become bus stops and streetscape elements, working with Jamie Carpenter in this case on some of the light elements to produce this pedestrian illuminated walkway along Vesey Street, incorporated that with lighting into a series of structures that provide shade during the day for the dog run, and nighttime lighting, which bounces back down to illuminate the pedestrian crosswalks, and let those little pieces that are actually sort of the remnants, if you will, of the city fabric actually come up and have their own presence in that environment. For better or for worse, after we did that project, we had a little bit of time sort of as like the security guys. And we had to, it's hard to shape that sometimes. You say, no, this is just good design. It's not security. But it did lead to a project David mentioned. We got hired after this. The city planning actually came in and said, why don't you guys take a look at the stock exchange? This is a terrible problem. We got 7 blocks, traffic cut off. We got all this standoff in the buildings around there. And this is the #1 economic target in Lower Manhattan. We said, yeah, it's the #1 target in Lower Manhattan. It's also like the most historic piece of the city. This is, you know, been here, the street grid was set up here in 1660, so to start monkeying with the street grid down here seemed really inappropriate. So we began to work to define the boundaries and the containment. What were the programmatic requirements of pedestrian space, of the new uses moving into Lower Manhattan, a lot of residential, new commercial uses, and taking on what we found, which was this kind of ever increasing. Every time Mr. Bush would, you know, talk about anything, somebody would come out and put another planter on the street, and try to sort of increase this level of defense until it's like, well, you got trucks, you got planters, you got gates, and this constant thing. Here's Wall Street, and over there on the left is a 4-foot little place where pedestrians can move on one of the major historic thoroughfares of the city. And on Broad Street, out in front of the stock exchange, everybody's forced into this little stuff on the side, and the militarization of the zone was a huge economic disincentive to anything reasonable beginning to happen to change Lower Manhattan. So the first thing we took on was, let's get the crap off the streets. So the Jersey barriers, there are other pieces, get it along, and let's design something which is the highest possible density that meets the requirements of all of those planters and other kinds of elements. And David was kind enough to mention these no-go, which are made out of maritime bombs, So they actually worked with the historic district. They sort of referenced some of the details of the building. They're very simple shapes, very carefully modeled to try and minimize their apparent and operational volume while maximizing the density as an object, as a security barrier. The problem was we couldn't erect operable devices in a lot of places. Again, if the fixed elements you can use for security are bad, then the operable elements for security are a disaster. They tend to be these big steel blades that rise up from the street. This is on Wall Street, really, is a terrific pedestrian environment there. And even though you can see the no-nos being installed on the left, they're going in, you know, we're still left with this other stuff. And, you know, as much as we like to think we create things, almost always somebody's created it before. And if you look around with other technology, you say, well, what about if we think about other things? In this case, you know, turntables, which have rotated locomotives for 150 years, and they rotate the elephant in the opera at the Met. You know, they can be really thin. They can do this thing, and we reinterpret it as a streetscape element. So it's very thin. It stays above all the utilities. All the fiber optics that run the New York Stock Exchange are only about 20 inches below grade. So the opportunity to move anything into the street is really tough. So we made these very shallow barriers that can rotate, kind of riffed our own maritime bronze and added some LED lights to create these rotating vehicle barriers in the street that opened up and had this sort of filtration of pedestrian occupancy moving through the street. It allows us continuity of paving and things. Those really great messages to pedestrians. Kind of taking care of the security, we still had the pedestrian space and the history of the area to discuss. So we went back and researched the maps, and the Dutch had built one canal in New Amsterdam, and it came up Broad Street. I guess you couldn't have a city without a canal. So they dug one up and along. Those Dutch, you know? And they come up, and so we said, well, let's bring that canal back, long gone, as a historic element, and reference it in the paving, development as a way to begin to understand and appreciate the new pedestrianization and potential occupancy of that space. And incorporate into that all the sort of descriptive material about the history of the development of this part of Lower Manhattan. And of course, Wall Street is not Wall Street because the buildings are tall. Wall Street is because that's where the Dutch had erected a barricade that lasted about 50 or 60 years. It didn't really keep out the Indians or the British, as we know in the end, but nonetheless, this was the wall maintained all the way across Wall Street. And most of the material about the wall talks of it as a stockade-type fence, and it was rebuilt about every 10 or 15 years as it rotted. So we said, well, let's bring back just enough of that as a reference point. These are these large pavers made out of southern yellow pine that then are inlaid along Wall Street and interrupted with a series of interpretive places that just simply mark and begin to describe that historical element that exists through the city. And restore the fundamental view corridors, the pedestrian space, incorporate history, and accept the programmatic constraints of the 21st century, which in this case was a series of security measures to secure this district. And we've been very delighted that this is sort of, the constituency is broad. I think it's something about working in the city when you begin to realize things are adapted and taken on and appreciated by a whole range of people and characters and types, from financial kids to kids visiting, is when you begin to really be excited. So, taking a bunch of those lessons from New York City, we've begun to expand a little bit, not quite this much, but it's aspirational. And of course, the first opportunity we got was security. So we said, okay, we got hired down at the Pentagon to look at the South Pedestrian Plaza, which is this beautiful space you see at the bottom of this photograph. And they were really interesting to get involved with, because for them, security is, you know, like that is really what they do. So all kinds of constraints and, you know, stuff they don't really want to hear about. where they have snipers and what kind of thing shoots out far. So, okay, this is good. But the perimeter was this disastrous stuff. Again, just sort of collections of things. People moved off. They're building they finished now the new memorial, which is terrific. So the pedestrian flows now have moved from military and civilian workers, depending on getting off and on buses, to actually a high tourist content moving across. And part of the program was, we want to manage the tourists. And it sounds bad in some ways, but it's like, we need to know when somebody's going where they don't belong. That's kind of the constraint. So we looked back historically and said, you know, this is not a new problem either. So if you look at the defense works and the earthworks, hundreds of years of wartime, probably the most elaborate in our own Civil War, of how those earthworks were put together to create, you know, how steep is it before you have to crawl? What is it, you know, what are those kind of constraints and issues? And the remnants of those earthworks, which have become national parks and actually phenomenal landscapes in their own right that tell that story, that we could say, let's understand the math, take a look at the science, look at what the landscape forms come from, and sort of define all of those pieces that existed at the pedestrian scale and reinterpret them at the scale of the distances and the vehicles and the threats that are now the criteria presented for that South Pedestrian Plaza at the Pentagon, and let the landscapes themselves manage vehicular approach and pedestrian operation around that perimeter. And I have to say the people we were working with was very compelling, that a key part of this mission was understanding that, you know, politically we have a civilian controlled military. And for that to be so, it also has to feel that way. It has to look that way. And the headquarters of that building, which is presented to all the tourists moving through there, has its own aspect of being an open public space while still containing all of those kind of criteria. No more security problems. So we also got invited to do a little park out in Cody, Wyoming, and it's a really interesting place where an initial agrarian culture essentially is being replaced by recreational opportunities. You know, it doesn't make a lot of sense to grow really anything at all in Cody, Wyoming, and it's not so great to raise cattle there either, actually. And that's been its lifeblood. So as it converts to a sort of recreational facility, we wanted that to be part of maybe a way to think about this park. The park was a few acres on the upper piece of the hill, which developed after the Second World War, and it was the site where the first irrigation canal was built through that part of the country, actually financed and built by Buffalo Bill, for whom the town is named. And when we got involved with it, the town had left this site. They'd actually been a gravel mine for a period of time, and all of the buildings had been built with their backs to this sort of little hole up on the hill in the middle of the city. And we said, well, this is a great thing because it's really is a place that you want to pass through as much as occupy. We were able to, with a series of research grants, get funding through the Abandoned Minelands Act because it had been a gravel mine, and began to think about what were the conditions on the site and how we could extrapolate those. And I visited during a huge snowstorm, and I loved to sit out and watch like how the wind managed all of the snow across that site. And we realized that we could actually map these little microclimates that existed across this 10-acre site that was essentially where the snow blew and drifted deep enough to create significantly different little climate zones across the space of the park. And that perhaps we could take those didactically in comparison to the irrigation canal, which was at the root of the origin of the city of Cody itself, and talk about water use in the West. You know, what is it to have a xeriscape plant base for the bulk of the park? You know, the giant bar that you see, of course, is the little bit of Kentucky bluegrass and that's what it takes. It takes about 4 feet of water per year to maintain Kentucky bluegrass in that particular climate, compared to all of the other sort of ecosystems. And so we could go down the hill and then locate more riparian zones below where we were actually going to locate the grass to sort of sub-irrigate. So the park became an amphitheater and a series of connective trails through the city that then describes the history of the geography, the history of the site itself, and talks about how that original water use that moved through and set up the city of Cody is now mapped out in the only piece of sort of bluegrass that exists in the park. And it's a little bit funny because when we started the project, the city engineers, we were hired by a private park conservancy group to do the park. The city engineers said, well, you guys can't build a park there because it's too steep to mow. And he's like, well, so we came back and said, we'll give you just a little bit of grass to mow and it will be level. So it's on the exact side of the original irrigation trench that ran through the city and actually fueled all the land growth at that time. Sometimes the programmatic elements are different. And we did our first religious project recently. It took almost 7 years, actually, 7 days, so kind of based on 7 you'll see as you go along. It was really compelling because we started it with a series of buildings. It's a synagogue, and it is up in Scarsdale. And the first building was by Marcel Breuer, and sort of very clear but not useful at all. It was quickly renovated and changed and expanded, then expanded and changed again. And finally, by the time we got involved, it was operating in a whole series of buildings in this sort of conglomeration on the hill. And the thing was to how do you come in and begin to, make sense of the site plan of the disparate elements, but engage in the mission and the thinking of the temple, which was basically as new to me as security concerns. Interestingly, we were the only firm on the short list that had no Jewish principles, and then we were selected. And it was, I think, in no small part because when they asked us about it, we said, well, clearly we have no preconceptions. So we came up with a master plan to present a new sanctuary and social hall and give a fundamental structure to the site, moving from the lower left to the upper right, going from west to east, that went from the sort of worldly buildings that would take on the educational roles into the social hall section, into the sanctuary, and finally into a spiritual and sacred garden. And once we got that structure, we began to look at, well, what is this space? You know, how do you make this? We talked at great length. Rabbis, great teachers, amazing to spend afternoons in conversation going through what is a sacred space, you know, and we talk about Exeter Library, we talk about other kinds of places you've been that introduce contemplation by the pure physical aspect of the space, and began to study and honed in on a Hebrew term that's at the core mission of the temple called tikkun olam, which is loosely translated mending or repairing, and it has to do with the idea that it's a moral responsibility to mend and repair the relationship of the world and mankind and God on a daily basis. And even though you repeat these certain things, it's something that has to be considered and contemplated continuously. So we thought we developed this idea of these 7 bands alternating between plaster and cedar. Cedar, the material of the original temple built by Solomon, and let those kind of wrestle with each other for resolution, reminding you of this kind of struggle. And they never, nothing quite closes, and when it does get close, it's stopped by daylight, either from a window or from a skylight. But introduction of some element, particularly light, that comes into the sanctuary and social hall. And those 7 bands only finally resolve on the 7th band, which is not quite whole, but it is almost complete. And that's what holds the bema. The bema is what holds the park and is central to their liturgy. And that would be the wall. That big 7th band would be the wall that separates the sanctuary from the spiritual garden and the sacred garden out there. And that's this sort of pursuit that goes on a regular basis. And of course, when you face the sanctuary east and most of the services are in the morning, we quickly realize that there's a huge sun problem associated with this thing, with a staggeringly silhouetted backlit potential for anybody on the bema. So we began looking at how to operate with that wall to manage and manipulate that. We said, what do we want it to be? We think it needs to be reflective. We want it to be abstract. We want it to have qualities that change. It shouldn't be the same thing all the time. And my wife, who's in our practice and we were working together on this project, saw this painting in Amsterdam. We said, my God, that's it. Van Gogh on the river is like, look at the reflection, look at the sort of the colors that come in as the abstraction. Can we produce that as a sort of architectural feature? So we began working with a company out of Detroit that made glass for concept cars and therefore had little work. And we're wide open to some R&D efforts. And so we came up with these series of bent glass louvers that were mirrored on the underside. And I'm glad to say, because it was Detroit, they're actually chromed on the underside, not in the mirror, because that's the technology they had. And came up with the idea that the wall actually had more functions. The big yellow one, which is we got to keep the sun out, but at the same time we can use it to daylight the sanctuary. That the garden in back is relatively small, and although like the bottom line you can see the garden, it's important to know your place in the world. That the spiritual garden represented something more, kind of an ideal, and that you should not really see it truly. So in fact, the series of bends allow you to see the garden primarily in the reflection of the underside of the series of louvers, and the faces distort the straight through, but they also reflect the congregation back onto itself. And our idea was that this wall then would change with the seasons every day. Every time you go there, it's another place that talks about your place in the world. And the bema, if you know, represents the ark. I mean, the ark carries the Torah, which historically was, carried about the desert for 40 years. And so that sort of infinite transferability we wanted to reference. So we decided to float the ark in the glass wall where you could see your place in the world. By reflection, you could have an idealized view of the garden that is the world. But the reflection of the congregation itself reminded the individuals and the collective of the responsibility of holding these things in this place. And it also means that a tiny garden outside, only about a dozen feet wide, blows open in springtime and sort of, ruptures in color, and the color spills way up the wall as a sort of daily backdrop for those services. And the building then is very quiet and state, and just a sort of a reference to the overall sort of banding of those features on the outside, so you think about it both coming and going, that the experience of this place is within. We're working for a gas and energy company in Oklahoma City. And it's our first energy company client, and it's really great because for somebody like a Temple, doing a new project is highly experimental. It's extraordinarily risky. It requires, a committee of 2,000, and it, is really challenging. And so for a corporate client now to come in and say, we're taking on a new place, we're reoccupying property in downtown, we're looking at a new headquarters place, we need a master plan to look at that, and the decision makers are, number one. It's terrific. And when we started the project after the first visit, I got down there. There's another huge tower underway in downtown Oklahoma City by one of the other gas and oil companies. And I said, that's the building that they're building there could be anywhere in the world. It could be built in Asia. It could be built in New York. That's like That's great. It's a very nice object. But what if you have another mission for your occupancy downtown? And rather than creating an icon, we actually talk about what's the civic performance of a headquarters in a downtown that's been deteriorating and is being rejuvenated. So we began to study the fabric and the grain, the conditions of the city, and realized that one street bordering the site really was the key connection of the major green spaces and the major civic spaces, the memorial to the bombing, the Myriad Gardens, which is their main city park, and a big central park that they're planning in the next decades. At the same time, the site on the other side was bound by really the most effective commercial corridor that exists in downtown Oklahoma, anchored by their convention center, the hospitality core. It actually has the restaurant row in part of it going up, and that this linkage between the commercial corridor and the civic corridor, the crux of it was the block and a half to 2 blocks that we would be working with at our site. At the center of the site is a terrific building by Pietro Belluschi, built about 40 years ago. And when we got involved, we said, you know, this thing is one of the best buildings of Belluschi's individual authorship that exists. He worked a lot with Gropius. He worked on the Pan Am building. He worked on the Juilliard School. But few buildings of this scale and size. And so we said, let's operate with the key feature that already exists and begin to let the new buildings and the landscape around there begin to focus on that piece. So we proposed what we're now calling the Sandridge Commons, in the long tradition of sharing of public and private space at the heart of the city, and taking it on piece by piece. The base of the building, although I've always sort of loved the tower and its stately brutality, the base of it was really difficult. So we right away started operating on how can we move and get a front door? How can we get some open space in and around the project to work with that? And taking cues from the geometry of Belluschi's work and the work of this company who does these maps that just take your breath away when you go through and see the seismic geological readings that they do on these things. And there's guys that can read this, really amazing. We just say, wow, that's beautiful. So we thought we'd incorporate those various elements and the sort of long tradition of Belluschi using sun shading and screening to begin to create elements that develop shadows and create a new base zone around the tower that references the new occupancy by keeping the tower itself as the central component of the piece. And if you've been to Oklahoma City, you'd know that the pages of this guy's book are probably fluttering when he's sitting here reading it, because it is a truly a kind of windy, crazy place. So we said, let's, instead of just developing the ordinary landscape around, in this case we're working with Peter Choate, a landscape architect from Chicago. So let's make a working landscape that is really about the habitability of the surrounds of the project itself. And make the goal of that landscape to say, let's make about 5 or 6 places that are really great, and 3 of them are good almost any time. You can't make everything good, but if you count the shoulder seasons through the summer and the other shoulder seasons, you've always got 2 or 3 places that you can move to on the site. So it's shady if it's hot, but it's sunny if it's cold. It's, you know, what are the variables to do that? And again, it's not a new idea. The notion of sort of making land breaks, you know, is common and in Oklahoma, and there's actually a lot of knowledge when you deal with local foresters who haven't ever brought it into the city, but have looked at it on an agricultural basis. So we engaged Arup and their environmental group to begin helping us study the opportunities to what do you need to make really fundamental, vibrant, engaged public space in the city of Oklahoma, using new technologies, wind tunnel testing with the buildings and landscape elements. That's the icon over there on the left, by the way. And saying, you know, how can we begin to produce the mitigation and the effects that we want within this overall landscape, so that in fact the qualities of the landscape itself begin to suggest not only the kind of historic and emblematic elements of Oklahoma in its landscape, in its weather and its form, but can be adapted to the site. And using a variety of kinds of thermal mapping and understanding what we can do, that you know, our goal is to go out and not make everything great, but to remove the most difficult sections, both in terms of heat and wind. So we're also introducing a series of structures on the site that, you know, along with, you know, everything White ever taught us about public space, movable chairs and everything else, but also making these habitable places in and across the site where you can collect together, you can have moments of intimacy, or you can be broader. And so we're now starting to develop the buildings and the architecture around the site. We're preserving the building on the left, which is the original granite by Solomon Layton, probably the most consequential architect to come out of Oklahoma. Beginning the new building on the right, and then there'll be a new commercial building on the far side, bordering the commercial street. So just to get a quick sense of how the architecture is trying to work hand in hand with the urban design and the landscape, is we put in the new building everything that doesn't fit in standard commercial towers, like auditoriums, fitness centers, gymnasiums, restaurants, daycare, everything that doesn't really belong in the other corporate environment, and brought that across the street, and struggled to think about this as a highly transparent building, so that you're adding energy not just to the street level, but all the vibrancy of those other programmatic functions become apparent throughout the city. So it's a steel structure wrapped around on top of a concrete structure, with a series of things from basketball on the roof to fitness centers within the screen of the outside. There's an outdoor climbing wall that goes from the terraces up to the upper roof, assembly halls, daycare facilities on the mid-level, and then restaurants engaging the public park. We're redoing all of the public park on this side of the block, so that you've actually got the draw of food and retail activity coming out into those public spaces, as we redesign an existing park on the corner for full accessibility, places for gathering, places for intimacy, trying to develop a true 12-month kind of atmosphere of the park. Fire fueled by natural gas, of course. And realizing that you can kind of program and recenter this piece of downtown with a series of corporate actions engaging the landscape and the long-term contemplation of that site. I'm going to have two more projects. This one is the Good News Project. This is a competition that we just won. And then the last one is, because life's not always has a happy ending, it's a great competition we love. So this is in Baltimore, East Baltimore, which has this unbelievable fabric of these two-story townhouses. It's one of the largest urban renewal areas currently being redeveloped in the United States, East Baltimore development. And essentially has seen incredible dilapidation and deterioration over the last generation. But has this incredibly intriguing fabric, because it's this low series of buildings, mostly 2 stories, occasionally 3 stories high, with sort of subgroups of buildings on alleyways, based on kind of a home ownership model of any income level when it was developed, 130 years ago. And so we're inserting into that a new K-8 school, and it's a very interesting and compelling urban design and urban renewal model. This project is about 4 blocks away from Johns Hopkins Medical Center, which is one of the leading medical research institutions in the world, and yet this is one of the hardest hit, most blighted neighborhoods in the entire Northeast coast. And so the idea is to bring in and develop a public school that is pedagogically, architecturally, urbanistically ambitious as an anchor for the rebirth of the residential districts around Johns Hopkins and this particular school. And it's got a really interesting mission in the way that they want to teach, because they combine classes and gather around what they call a house, so 2 grades work together, more like a college residence program in colleges or something, where the kids associate with this house and then move on to another one, up. And we thought that was really compelling in terms of what it meant for kids as they move through the school environment and how they learn to engage their neighborhood and their school and their city. So we proposed that as the children grow from kindergarten up through 8th grade, the houses start out very introverted and grow in complexity as the child ages as well. We also looked at an ideal classroom for each one of these ages and types and modeled those to understand, who's on the floor and what kind of spaces do you need for certain age groups as you move through, and began to test how those classrooms could work together in abstract configurations, and then began to look at the fabric of the existing neighborhood itself for fronts and backs to develop a strategy for building these houses, these classrooms and resource rooms around that central block, letting you go from introverted to coordinated without, linked in between, and letting a series of outdoor spaces be associated with every house so that there's private as well as sort of common spaces through each one of those elements. And pulling the houses up to be the volumetric centers of each of those spaces. Organized across there to pull the grain and the fabric of the neighborhood back through those elements of the piece. So that this new community school gets inserted into the neighborhood, referencing the fabric and the icons that have been there. This is the taking away of the street to produce the new commons. Looking at the tight alleyways that were the sort of early beginnings of social structures and how those could work within the school as well. And taking the materiality and the formality that created the historic structures of East Baltimore and put some of those back. Part of the project has a preservation component, part of it has new pieces, and also let the socialization that was a part of that street through materiality of these white marble steps which line block after block, and return those to the school as the amphitheater, as the component of public use, as the interface between the school and the public. And that these quality of the monuments of the neighborhood, whether it's a church or a brewery, that stood up above everybody in sort of in the working areas, would then be interpreted in terms of these educational houses that are the volumes of the new school that are associated with each grade, and become in fact the presence of the school itself within the urban fabric. The project, that competition we won, and we're now starting on it, so it's also, if the architecture looks slightly undeveloped, it's coming, but the planning components got us the project. So it was really there. I thought it was fun to talk about because it's sort of the actions within the city and the neighborhood and the fabric that precede a lot of the architectural decisions that would come. Another competition, this last one, was for the Eisenhower Memorial in Washington, D.C. We were one of 4 teams, and we loved getting to learn about Eisenhower. Incredibly simple upbringing, kid from Kansas who rose to be the Supreme Commander in the Second World War and then President of the United States. And then anecdotes about him were things like, it was this unbelievable ability to be slightly casual but always crisp. And we loved that sort of connotation of the character of him as a man in general. But at the same time, we're saying, well, what is a monument now in Washington, D.C., when, I got your picture on the top of the bus in front of the Capitol? It's become, how we look at our monuments and our urban elements. So the site is right where the word Maryland is. It's Maryland Avenue is cut off. The traffic doesn't flow through there, but that view corridor exists. The big Smithsonian Air and Space Museum is the big block to the right of the circle. And the swirly triangle thing is the ghastly museum put up a few years ago. So for the American Indian Museum. I'm sorry, but it's just terrible. And then just south of Maryland, there is the education headquarters building, which is a kind of nice, banal, standard Washington building. So you've got Washington, D.C., you've got sort of the angularity, the severity, the importance of the site, and you have Eisenhower the man. And one of the other things that we read about him a lot was his direct engagement of the troops. And we felt that that direct engagement was a conceptual key starting point. That this was not the oversized statue on the pedestal, it was not something else, but actually required the engagement of the human condition at that particular scale. We also want to think about the nature of monuments, and especially those related to Eisenhower's life, which are the presidential monuments that exist in Washington, D.C. The monuments, there's actually a Great Prairie National Monument that exists. That's the agrarian roots, really, of 20th century Americans, all of us. And then there's this sort of the crazy landscape that comes from war and human conflict, and begin to merge those ideas with the geometries and context of Washington, D.C. So we developed a premise where we said it's really, Eisenhower is kind of this red stripe and the story of his life from an unassuming service career in the Philippines. Early in World War I, he thought he passed over. He hadn't really ascended. He was doing some tank training and doing other kind of things. And only at World War II was he brought up to the ranks, and his amazing capacity for leadership was realized. And then we thought we'd carry along Maryland Avenue, which is the view corridor that looks towards the Capitol, kind of the American 20th century, because that really was the story of Eisenhower, from the kid on the corn farm who became the sort of leader of the largest free country in the world at that time. And let those two intersections be the story and the basis of the geometry. So we created a small pavilion on the left and a large pavilion on the right. The early one talking about his commitment to public service. The larger pavilion talking about leadership and the role of what comes with leadership in the world environment. And the intersection is World War II, literally the crossing. And in this case, working with the landscape architects Nelson, Bird, and Volz out of Virginia and New York. So there's sort of the two-scale pavilions with the crossing, so that the American prairie was actually brought in as a foreground to the pavilions themselves and a foreground of this particular view of the Capitol. This kind of a moment of that recollection and reference. That the early years of Eisenhower, we actually embraced the idea of figurative statuary in this monument and said, Eisenhower, the boy contemplating the field, is a very quiet moment that is completely shareable and completely comprehensible. And that the service pavilion is really a place where you could hold events, you could honor people with civil service awards, with other kind of things that really talk about those that aspire and achieve to a certain level of public commitment. But the crossing was this tension point where we introduced water, referencing the D-Day crossing, of course, and the ascent to the pavilion on the far side. And it's only here where you see Eisenhower in sort of formal statuary, but his life size is placed on the ground. And you see in the backdrop the etched-in mural of the D-Day assault reflected in the reflecting pool. And then move through this large-scale pavilion where we've moved now to the interpretive elements where we're all intended to be 3D milling in marble to create a lenticular, so that the pavilion is completely clean when you're looking on an acute angle, but as you step in, the interpretive material is available to you when you're in that particular zone, so that the figure exists only in that sort of dead-on perspective in that pavilion, yet is there to captivate and frame and understand what is the role of leadership relative to the state of the country and its condition, and that it exists in that drive-by scale as well as a pedestrian scale in the context and formality next to the Air and Space Museum. But we lost. So that's it. Thank you very much. If we have time, I'm delighted to take questions.
Project in Wyoming, how did that one come about? It seems like an obscure location to town project.
We had a really great client, and we had done a residential project, and she was a mover and shaker in the community. And she was the one who first had approached the city and said, "Oh, I can get a group together to buy this land. We can want to do these things." And the city manager, whose background was in corrections, said, "You know, we don't want any more parks. We don't need any parks. Besides, the guys say it's too steep to go." So she said, "Rob, can you come and help me live in this? Because I really think it's a great thing what you do." So it was sort of early beginning of some of our more spatial landscape.
In your Baltimore project, did you make any specific design allowances for the high crime rate in that area?
We did. It is, you know, it's about a 3-year project. It's very interesting. The incredible optimism that exists within the groups around that. The project is funded by TIF, tax increment financing, that comes off of Johns Hopkins in a decision that their expansion in that neighborhood is sort of no longer morally possible without addressing the neighborhood that is there. So that's part of the funding of the school. They've also made a sort of a commitment to participate in the staffing and teaching engaged in the school. And as the school gets constructed, they expect that to actually drive the renovation and rehabilitation of the residential projects around the sites and area. There is a diagram I didn't show because I was on security overload, but shows the secure perimeter of the school.
So I have an odd question for you. So like, you guys are doing really well. And it's a tough time. You guys have done really well. And you've grown this firm from very small to very big. It's this big kind of question from a small firm growing big. And I wonder if you talk a little bit about, like, so we used once I got a chance to ask Val, I know, what do you look for in an employee that's stamina? You know? So I wonder, what do you look for? Like when you're looking at, I mean, you guys have built this firm, you guys are doing really well. When you're looking at what are the kinds of qualities that do well in a firm for you, what are the things you're looking for?
Well, we just made the decision on Friday to hire one of your graduates, a guy named Jonathan Locke.
Oh God, no! Stop!
But it's rescinded. He went on to get a master's at Columbia and all this other stuff. But when you looked at his portfolio, the staggering, and I don't know, I didn't even, the staggering amount of work that he did, and he didn't investigate things one way. It wasn't page after page after page of the digital model, or page after page of plans. It was plans, sections, physical models, digital models, research. You know, he could diagram, he could draw, he could do all this other kind of stuff. And I'm presuming the credit goes more to you than to Columbia in this, but see, that the digital model made it come. You know, and now he's been at SOM for a while, and he is serious. You know, he is a serious guy, and he wants to make buildings. And we're, maybe I shouldn't name names, I don't know, whatever, but it's okay. You know, we build almost everything we do. When we lose a competition, we don't build it. And when you master plan for the Pentagon, the chance of it getting built before 2038 is low. But most of our projects lead to buildings, to parks, to places, to things. And I think that stamina is a great word. I wouldn't have come up with it, but that's sort of the energy and seriousness, which is not to say levity is not important. You and I share that. but it's an attitude about wanting to really make things, about doing a job. Like, what's the outcome here? What's the outcome in this community for this school? Or what's it really going to do? The school was bowled over because we went down there and met with them, and we won the competition. We went through that thing and said, now, which one of these buildings are you going to sell us to put a field office in so we can develop it and be the first speculators on the success of the school? And they were like, are you serious? Point it out. Give us a corner of the building. It's like when you embrace a problem, you've got to believe it and take it on.
Well, that was the question I was going to get to. So you're presenting this stuff, and I really appreciate the fact that you're presenting it and making the argument that there is this kind of civic component to all this work, and that you focus on that. But that's what I wanted to talk a little bit about. I remember when we moved here to Austin, the only architects that survived were architects who actually had a kind of civic conscience in that kind of dip of the 1990s, because they had people had continued to hire them for ethical reasons. And I'm wondering if that was a thing that you found to be true as well, that part of your success has to do with not just putting your money where your mouth is, but actually putting your mouth where your mouth is. You know what I mean?
I think so, and I think it's sort of certainly in the realm of public space and civic works and other kinds of things. I feel anyway, like we've begun to earn our credibility in that realm a little bit, and credibility takes a very long time to get and a very short time to lose. So it's not like you can. And you can't ever, I don't think you can ever have a project that you don't take deadly seriously. And once you take it on, it could be a house, it could be something else, it could be a block and a half in Oklahoma City, but you tackle it, with the energy and attention, all the energy and attention that you can bring to bear. I don't know if that, and it's hard to find those people, but you try.
This is a sort of a follow-on question. You showed a pretty great range of work from the barriers and so forth, but your firm also does product design and housewares and children's furniture and things like that. Are you vertically integrated, or are you partitioned in some way so that you have teams that tend to go toward one scale or end of the spectrum, or how does that work?
The furniture is a little bit. The rest of it's completely horizontal. Furniture, just because we have an industrial and graphic designer, and they tend to work on those projects at that scale. And it really, I explained this a little bit earlier today, I think at lunch something, but the furniture design elements are a little bit more, not that our architecture is not opportunistic, but it's not like we're out constantly seeking somebody to hire us to do furniture. Things spin out of projects, and then we take it on as a small scale development. Or somebody approaches us, we develop a licensed product for that thing. And so that group is a little bit more focused. They cross over and integrate. It's more like those guys work in the studio sometimes when we have issues at that scale than the people in the architecture studio, working on pieces of furniture.
Will you do furniture for the Oklahoma City project, things like that?
We did. We finished their executive floors, and I didn't show that because it's sort of, I didn't know where to put an interiors group in that thing, and we did almost all the furniture for those executive floors. Some of that we may take for development. One of the tables, I think, was that somebody came up with in the office, and it was one of the architects. It's kind of brilliant, and I think it may have life, elsewhere. But then you have to, it's really hard where you need the separation vertically, is the marketing of furniture services is radically different than the marketing of architectural services. And it's hard to exist in those two worlds at the same time. Anybody else?
Well, thank you.
Thank you.